Masechet Ketubot, Daf Lamed Tet. More about comparing the cases of rape and seduction, the violator's obligations to her in various cases. So we begin, Amar Abaye ba'aleha umeta patur shenemar v'natan la'abi ha'na'ara v'lo la'abi meta. If you have a case where a man rapes a na'ara, between 12 and a half. And then it takes time to bring him to court. Then the court has to find him guilty. And before the court finds him guilty and before he pays, she, the victim, dies. In that case, the man, the violator, does not have to pay the father because the pasuk says that he will give the father of the na'ara, meaning that the na'ara has to be in existence. And that excludes a father of someone who has died. And therefore, he doesn't have to pay. He gets out of it. Okay. Now, this was a statement of Abaye, and Abaye knew the halacha. It was simple to him that this is the clear-cut halacha. But Rava did not know this conclusion of Abaye. He asked it as a question and actually never gave a clear answer to it. Rava, yesh beged bakeved or en beged bakeved. He formulated, we're going to see a couple of different formulations of the question. This one is, does a young woman become a beged, a bogeret, after death, meaning if she dies a few days before she's 12 and a half. So at the moment she dies, she's a na'ara. Does time continue for her? And she, after a few days later, on her 12th and a half birthday, she would have the law as if she were an adult. Or once she dies, time stops for her and she remains a na'ara the whole time. Now, what would be the difference in the law, in the outcome? Yesh beged bakeber v'dibna haveh. If you say that she becomes a beged, then even after death, then the fine would go to her son. Let's back up and explain this law. Let's say she's alive. She remains alive the whole time. And she is raped or seduced a few days before she becomes 12 and a half. And then by the time they go to court, it takes some time to go to court for the court to decide. If the court sentences him after she becomes 12 and a half, once she's an adult, then he does have to pay the fine, but he pays the fine to her. He only pays the fine to the father when the sentencing is before she's 12 and a half. So therefore, let's apply it to this case. Here, the rape happened when she was a na'ara. And then she died while she's a na'ara. So, and the sentencing is after. So what do we consider that? So we consider that time stopped for her when she died. So she's a na'ara forever, even after many months, or not? Or does she, since the time elapsed, even though she's died, time elapsed, and therefore it would go to her. She's dead, so then it will go to her son. How does she have a son? We'll hold on to that thought. Or do we say, no, a woman does not become an adult once she died. She remains in her state of na'ara, and therefore, it's just like if she were alive, he would pay the father. So too, even though she died, as she remains a na'ara, even though many months have passed, and therefore he pays the father. Okay, that was Rava's question. Now, before we answer it, actually we're never going to answer it, but first we want to clarify, what do you mean she has a son? How is it possible that this na'ara could have a son? Certainly wouldn't be by marriage, because if she was married, then it would be a different law altogether for the fine. We're talking about a son out of marriage. Is it possible, physically possible, for such a young person to have a child? Umi me'abera, can she become pregnant? We're going to derive from this long baraita the fact that a girl before 12 years old cannot even become pregnant, or if she does become pregnant, she will die. She cannot bear and give birth to a healthy baby. So we're going to prove that. So how do we know that? Because the law is that 3 women are allowed to use a cloth to prevent them from conceiving. Okay, Elohen, who is that? Ketana me'oberet menika, a child, a woman who is pregnant, or a woman who is nursing. Let's see. Ketana shematit aber v'tamut. If she's a child, then she might become pregnant, and if she does, she will die. So there's a certain age when she's very young, she can't become pregnant. At a certain age, the middle stage, when she can become pregnant but can't bear a child healthily, and she'll die. And so therefore, she has to use contraception so that she doesn't put herself into that danger of becoming pregnant and dying. We'll see what age that is exactly. And if she's already pregnant, they seem to have thought that a pregnant woman, if she engages in relations, can become pregnant again with a twin. And there won't be room for both of them, and therefore the new baby will cause the one that was already there to be smashed, and it will come out deformed, looking like a sandal. Some say like a sandal fish, which itself actually looks like a sandal, or maybe it's just a sandal. The point is that it's not going to be fully formed. Interestingly, this fish is also known as sole in English because it looks like the sole of a sandal. So in Hebrew and in English, there's a similarity between the shape of the fish and the shape of a shoe. And so we worry about that. And therefore, a woman who is already pregnant can engage in relations, but if she does, she should use contraception. Menika shema tigmol et bena. A woman who's nursing, if she becomes pregnant, then she will have to, her milk will either stop or spoil, and then that will put her baby, who she's nursing, in danger. Okay, so therefore she can use contraception as well. Now, Ve'ezoi Ketana Baita wants to tell you exactly what age do we permit contraception. Mibat asrat esrei shana ve'yom echad ad shetem esrei shana ve'yom echad, from the 11th birthday and 1 day until the 12th birthday and 1 day. Pachot miken ve'yater al ken meshameshet kedarka ve'holechet divrei Rabbi Meir. Less than that, and after that, she does not need to use contraception, or maybe cannot use contraception. So the reason is because when she's younger than 11, then she cannot become pregnant at all. Since she cannot become pregnant, she's not going to be in danger of health danger. So actually, there was an article in the news a few weeks ago when we had that case of the 10-year-old who became pregnant. And the article actually said that a few decades ago, there's a black and white picture of the youngest person on record who ever successfully gave birth to a child, and she was 5.5 years old. That was a very unusual case. Her hormones were completely out of whack, but that is the world record. Okay, but in any case, in a usual case, less than 11 years old, a girl will not become pregnant at all. And after she's 12 years old, then she can become pregnant and have a healthy and be healthy and give birth. The problematic age is between 11 and 12, and there she can become pregnant, but she can't bear the baby, and she may die. She will die. So therefore she has to use contraception. That's the words of Rabbi Meir. So we see from here that it's impossible for a na'ara to have a child, because to have a child as a na'ara, that means before 12 and a half, that's the definition. 12 and a half is the end of na'arut. She has to have a child before 12 and a half. How could you ever have a child before? If she has a child, even right before she's 12 and a half, obviously she became pregnant, but before she was 12 years old. We just said it's impossible for her to have to be alive and have a child before 12 years old. And if it was even way before that, she couldn't become pregnant at all. So that was a challenge to the Braita up here that said that if she becomes a beged, then the fine goes to her son. What do you mean? It's impossible physically impossible to have for her to have a son, according to the Rabbi Meir. Now, Chachamim omerim, achad zo v'achad zo meshameshet kedarka veholechet, umin hashamayim yirhamu, mishum shene'emar shomeh petayim Adonai. Chachamim say, all these women, they can engage in relations, and don't worry, Hashem will have mercy on them. These simple people, poor people. In other words, Hashem will make sure that they don't get pregnant, the nursing woman, the child. the pregnant woman, and so you don't have to worry about it. We don't usually rely on this to put yourself in danger and say Hashem will provide. But in a case where it's unlikely anyway that there will be a problem, so then we're relying on it. Okay, according to Hachamim also, it seems that he believes that a girl will not become pregnant. He just thinks that you don't need contraception because she won't become pregnant anyway. Either way, a girl cannot have a child before she's 12 and a half. Impossible. So what are you talking about? And so maybe you'll say she got pregnant while she's in Na'ara, and she gave birth also while she's in Na'ara. But that period is only 6 months. You can't give birth in 6 months, right? In Talmudic times, the max they thought was possible was 7 months. But we know Na'arut is only 6 months long, from 12 to 12 and a half. It's not necessarily the exact birthday. It has to do with physical signs as well. But anyway, it's 6 months. And maybe you'll say, well, maybe Shmuel was teaching us that it's never less than 6 months, but maybe it could be more than 6 months if between two hairs and a majority of black more than white, like we saw before, maybe that will be more than 6 months. And so maybe it's possible that it could be 7, 8, 9 months. No, but it says Ela, right? Meaning there's not the difference between Narut and Baglut is only 6 months. Now Shmuel was saying it's exactly 6 months and it's not more. So therefore, it's impossible that she had a child. So, you know what? We're going to reject that formulation of the question, and there's no way that the payment will ever go to her child. So we reformulate. This is what he actually asked. Yesh beged bakever upakaav, or dilma en beged bakever velo pakaav. Do we say that when she was raped as a na'ara and she dies as a na'ara, do we say she once the 12 and a half mark comes, even though she is in the grave, nevertheless she becomes a bogeret, and now the father doesn't get the payment anymore, right? Does the father not become eligible to receive it as if she were a grown woman? Or do we say no, she does not become a grown woman in the grave, and the father's status does not leave her, and the father can continue? So here the question is not whether her son would get it, since she can't have a son. If she were alive and she became a bogedet, she would get it. Since she's dead and she has no son, therefore he would not have to pay at all. So if she remains a na'ara forever, then the father can collect. If she becomes an adult even after death, then the father would not get it and he would not have to pay at all. That's so that question makes sense. But yet another version of the question, Mor bar Rav Asher ba'ayla hachi mita osa bagrut or en osa bagrut. His question, formulation question is, and at the act of death, is that the same as her becoming an adult? In other words, even according to this formula, if you said that time continues, yeah, but it would only continue when she's 12 and a half, then the father would no longer get it. In this formula, the second she dies, even if she's just 12 years and 1 day, the second she dies, the act of death makes the father no longer eligible, and she becomes the same. She's not actually an adult. She's not alive, and she's not 12 and a half. But there will be the same law, and once she dies, the father therefore would no longer get the fine. Or do we say no? The death itself does not make her like an adult, and the father can still collect it. The difference here would be those in between months if the sentencing happened between her death and the 12 and a half birthday. Anyway, both of these questions are left unresolved according to Rabbah, even though Abaye did think above that the father does not receive it, right? Once she dies, the father does not get the amount, and he did have a derivation. Okay, and now so we come back with a new question. What if a man rapes a woman, and then, right, so he's going to have to pay, but in the meantime, she becomes betrothed to a man. Does he still have to pay, even though now she's betrothed? Does he still have to pay the father? Mahu amale miketiv natan la'abiha na'ara asher lo arusa. And so Abaye answered, does it say that he gives to the father who is not engaged, of the father of the girl who is not engaged? Doesn't say that, meaning yes, he would have to pay the father no matter what. What's the difference if he's engaged or not? The pasuk just says he pays the father of Nadara. Doesn't matter what status of betrothal she is. Okay, that's his answer. But now we challenge it. Yeah, but we know the law is that if she was raped when she was single, and then she got married, fully married, and then the sentencing happens, then the rapist has to pay her. She gets the money. Because she's married, she's no longer under the dominion of her father. She leaves it, and now she's independent, and she gets to collect the fine. And in that case, Miketiv and Natan la'aviha na'ara shelo nesu'ah, the pasuk doesn't say, give it to the father of Na'ara as long as she's not married. It doesn't say that. And yet, the law is that she gets it. So maybe the same thing with betrothed. Also, she would get it. And don't tell me a proof that the pasuk doesn't say. The pasuk doesn't say regarding Nisua either, even though she does get it in that case. Okay, so Abaye will answer, Hachi hashta, these are not the same. Hatam ho'il ubagrut mosi'ah mershut av, v'nisuin mosi'in mershut av. Ma bagrut ba'aleha ubagra le'atzma, af nisuin ba'aleha v'niset le'asma. And regarding becoming an adult, when she becomes an adult, she receives the money herself. Why? Because once she becomes an adult, she is no longer under the dominion of her father. Getting married also removes her from being under the authority of her father. So therefore, it's correct to compare them. Just like when she becomes an adult, so now she receives the fine herself. So too when she gets married and no longer under the authority of the father, she receives the fine herself. So that makes sense. Marriage is like becoming an adult. But when someone is betrothed, she's not yet removed from the authority of her father. How do we know? When a woman is betrothed, both her father and her husband can annul her vows. So she's kind of in between, in that in-between state. Yes, she is under the somewhat under the authority of her husband, but not yet removed from the authority of her father. And therefore, since the father still has authority, the father does get the fine, even though she was betrothed. And so it's not really because of the Pisukim. The Pisukim are the same in both cases, but rather because conceptually the cases are very different. All right, and now we get to the next Mishnah. Hamefaten noten shelosha devarim v'ha'ones arba'a. And so this is about differences between the case of seduction and rape. When a man seduces, meaning he convinces a na'ara to willingly be with him, even though it's consensual, but she's too young to give consent, and therefore he did commit a crime, but he has to pay only 3 things. The rapist is worse. He has to pay 4 items. Let's see what they are. Hamefaten noten boshet ufagam uknas. The one who seduces, the kanas, that's what we've been talking about this whole time, the fine, and he also has to pay for her humiliation. That's her subjective feeling of humiliation because of it, and also pegam, degradation. She's of lower value on the market, whatever that value is, so he has to pay that amount. Umosif alav ones shenotenet asa'ar. Now, the one who rapes has to pay those 3 things, all plus also pain. Any pain that he inflicted upon her. We'll see exactly what we're talking about during that act, during that crime. He has to pay for the value of the pain. Okay, ma ben ones limifate. Wow, what's the difference? Ha-ones noten la'astet asar, v'mifate eno noten et asar. The one who rapes has to pay for the pain. The one who seduces does not have to pay for the pain because she was willing. Therefore, he's not being violent against her. He's not being violent. He's not causing her pain. If it was painful, she would say, "Stop, this is hurting," and then he would stop. If he doesn't stop, then he's a rapist, and then it's violent. So because not violent, there is no pain. Gemara will discuss this as well. The things that they do not have to pay are interesting, and that is shevet and ripui, the amount that you have to pay to a doctor if there is any injury, and the time off from work. Also, he does not have to pay neither of these cases. Why not? The reason is because assuming that the injury is that she no longer has bitulim, and so that does involve pain, and it could be that she needs to see a doctor, or she may be out of commission, out of work for a couple of days. So how come he doesn't have to pay that? The answer to that is because eventually, when she gets married, then she would be with her husband would, when they consummate the marriage, she would lose her betulim. And whatever loss of work and doctor, should she need a doctor in such a case, would have happened anyway. So now it was just happening, not planned. But since that would have happened anyway, so the seducer and rapist don't have to pay for it. Okay, so that's why they don't have to pay for those things, but they do have to pay for the other items. There are a couple of more differences between the rapist and seducer. Ha'ones noten miyad v'mfateh l'chshei yosi. The rapist has to pay the fine immediately, even though he also has to marry her, assuming that she wants to and her father wants to and is permitted to marry. So he has to marry her. And but yet he has to pay the fine now, before the marriage, as soon as the sentencing happens. Whereas the seducer, only when he releases her, when he divorces her. In other words, the mefateh also, should they get married, he doesn't have to pay the fine immediately, but rather, if they don't get married, then he would have to pay the fine now. But if they do get married, then he doesn't have to pay the fine until the end of the marriage. In other words, it's the same amount of a ketubah for a betula. So the point is, he gets married like a normal woman would. There he owes her, he is responsible to pay her the 200 zuz, which is the same as the 50 shekel, and only at the end of marriage, then he or his estate would have to pay her. Okay, ha'ones, the Gemara will discuss that. Ha'ones shoteh ba'asisob mfateh im rasa lehosi mosi. The rapist, he has to drink from his pot. This is a euphemism, meaning that he must marry her, and it's called a pot, just like someone drinks out of a pot. The word atzitz is not the same as a fancy china cup, but rather is something used for pottery that's very cheap, that usually you'd use just for a potted plant. Gemara will see why. Right now, we'll see why it says that. And so the point is that the rapist, that's it. You drank from it, you broke it, you bought it, and he has to marry her, and the marriage therefore is a responsibility. He has to pay for her and take care of her his whole life, pay for her food, clothing, shelter, treat her nicely like a wife. She is a wife, and therefore that'll make him think twice before raping her, right? You better be committed to this. And again, if she wants. Whereas the seducer, if he wants to divorce her, he can, and that means also that he doesn't have to marry her in the first place. So the seducer we do not force him to marry. So that's a major difference, and so these are connected because he doesn't have to marry her. Therefore, if he does, it's willing, and therefore it's like a regular marriage. He pays the ketuvah fine amount at the end. Kesad shoteh ba'asiso, afilu hi chigeret, afilu hi soma, v'afilu hi mukat shechin. What do you mean that he has to drink from his pot, even if she's lame or blind or she has boils? He can't say, oh, she's not attractive to me. She was attractive enough that you took advantage of her disabilities, perhaps, and that's why he raped her in the first place. She was attractive enough that you violated her. So now you have to live with her. So maybe that's why it's called a pottery, not a fine pottery, but an atzitz. Okay, so all right. Nimsa ba devad arva o shenaruya lavo beYisrael eno rashai lekayem hashnemar velo tiyeh leisha isha hareuya lo. If, however, there is some matter of adva, meaning if she is unfaithful to him during the marriage, or she is someone who's not marriageable, be like she's a mamzeret or something, then he cannot marry her or remain married to her, because it says that regarding the rapist, velo tiyeh leisha, she will be to him as a wife, meaning as a wife, only a wife who is suitable to him, that he's permitted to. So that would be the only way out for the rapist. Okay, so now back to the beginning of the Mishnah. Sa'ar demai, he has to pay. The rapist, but not the seducer, has to pay for the pain. Okay, what kind of pain are we talking about? Amar Abu Shmuel Sar shechabatal gabe karka. This is the pain that he slammed her onto the ground during the violence, when he forced himself upon her. Matkif la Rabbi Zera ela me'ata chabatal gabe shirayin hachiname de patur. Hold on, Rabbi Zera says, what if he forced her on top of silk mattress, right? And there was no pain, and he did not push her on the ground, and she did not feel pain. So then there would be no pain, and he wouldn't have to pay sa'ar. Now maybe you'll say, indeed, we're talking about incidental pain, not pain from the act itself, but rather from other violence. And if you say that's true, it can't be true. Shimon ben Yehuda omer mishum Rabbi Shimon ones eno mishalem ela hasa'ar mipnei shesofa lista'er tachat ba'ala. So he said that the rapist does not have to pay for pain, because she's going to end up feeling the same pain with her husband. So now, obviously, we're not talking about pain of violence of being forced on the ground. The husband is not doing that, but rather we're talking about pain from losing her betulim. That's the pain we're talking about. And since she is a betula, he only pay the fine if she is a betula. Then so the pain must be talking about that, and therefore he would have to pay for pain no matter what, even if it was on silk sheets and there was no other pain. The pain is for that. Now, so that's how we know that that's true. Now, there's a machloket about that. That was only the opinion of Rabbi Shimon, but Amru lo, the rabbi said to him, "No domeh nib'adet be'ones lenib'adet be'rason." They said, no, it's completely different. You can't compare the victim of rape to a woman who, in marriage, willingly loses her betulim, even though technically it's the same act, but certainly the feeling of pain is going to be much more when it's done violently against her will, as when it's done when she eventually gets married. It would be like, a doctor does some kind of surgery that hurts. It hurts, but it's something that you want to do, that you are willing, and it's healthy. So the pain is more bearable than if a violent person comes and does that same act and is something that you don't want and is harmful to you. So certainly the feeling of pain is going to be much greater. Okay, so therefore he would have to pay, even though she would feel that pain eventually. Anyway, it's not the same amount of pain. Okay, so anyway, we prove from here that the pain we're talking about is not the pain of being forced violently onto the ground, but rather a different kind of pain. Ela amar Rav Nachman amar Rabba bar Abu sar pshel pisuk haraglayim. So rather, it's the pain of her spreading of her legs, which is a euphemism, meaning from either the breaking of her hymen or just the friction that she's feeling, and that would be painful. And we learn that from Pasuk, where it's talking about Bnei Israel who follow idolatry, and that is like someone who is with every man, and that is because it's unwilling that is painful to her. So that's the pain that we're talking about, and therefore that would happen in every case and always has to be paid, even if there's no other, besides any other incidental violence and pain that he causes her. Now we ask, wait a second, then for seduction also, if we're not talking about violence and being thrown on the ground and other kinds of pain, well then the seduced girl also will feel the pain from the intercourse itself, wouldn't she? Why doesn't he have to pay pain for sa'ad for this in the seduction case? It's different for the mifuta because it's consensual. So even though it's a crime because she's not an adult, so that's true. But in terms of the feeling of pain, that does make a difference. Because she's consensual, it'll be like a person who says to his friend, come and tear my silk garment and you don't have to pay, right? A person has the right to allow someone else to cause him damage, right? I say you can damage my property and it's okay, you won't have to pay. The same thing with a person can say, punch me, I want you to punch me and you won't have to pay. So even though she is not an adult, she can agree to experience pain because she agreed to it, and therefore that particular aspect he does not have to pay for. Okay, sheli pater. Now we're going to ask, what do you mean shkirain sheli? Is this really like her silk? Sheli da'abunin hu. It goes to the father, since the payment goes to the father. So what do you mean? How can she? Even though she conceded, how could she concede and make her father lose the money? It's like someone saying, here, rip my friend's garment. That you can't do. Ela amar Rav Nachman amar Abba bar Abu pikechot shebehen omerot mefuta en la sa'ar. So rather, we turn to the wise women who know they have experience, and they say that a seduced woman does not feel pain because she's willing. So therefore, she'll be in the mood. There won't be friction, and she won't feel terrible pain like someone who is unwilling. Okay, and now we say, okay, very good that those wise women said that, but we see even married women, the first time they consummate, they feel pain from the breaking of the betulim. Right, so there is pain. And so the rabbis say, no, there's not so much pain. How did the rabbis know? They asked the woman that they were in touch with. And Abaye's mother, it's not actually his mother, it's his nurse who brought him up because his mother had died. But anyway, she says a lot of things. She's very wise, and she says that you know what it feels like when the bitulim are broken. It's like hot water on the head of a bald man. So I guess it's a sensitive area, and it hurts somewhat, but it's not terrible pain. So we wouldn't have to pay for it. Rava amra li bat Rav Chista ki ribda de chosilta. Rava said that the daughter of Rav Chista, that's his wife, right? He asked his wife, what did it feel like? And she said, it's like the stab of a bloodletting knife. I assume that's a sharp knife, like a razor. And so if someone gets surgery with a razor, if it's very sharp, it doesn't hurt that much. It'd be like, getting an IV put in, right? It stings, but it's not so bad. Papa amar amrali bat Abba Sura'a ki nahama akusha bechinche. Abba Sura's daughter, that was his wife, said it feels like biting down on hard bread if you don't have teeth on gums. So you feel pressure, but not pain. Okay, so it's good the rabbis turn to their wives or other women to ask them what their experience was. And so if it's a case of when she's willing, either in the case of seduction or she's married, then yes, it does hurt somewhat, but not so much. It's bearable. And so he wouldn't have to pay sa'ad just for that. Okay, ha'ones noten miyad v'mefateh leches sheyosi. The Mishnah continues and said that the rapist has to pay immediately, even if he ends up marrying her and never divorcing her. He has to pay this now, but for the seducer, he pays only at the end of the marriage, should he marry her. Okay, lich sheyosi ishtohi. What do you mean when he divorces her? They're not married yet. So what we mean is, if he decides not to marry her, then he has to pay at that point. He has to pay immediately. But if he does marry her, then he doesn't have to pay until the marriage ends. Baraita says explicitly, says even though the seducer does not have to pay the fine, only pays the fine if he doesn't marry her. Then he has to pay the fine immediately. But if he does marry her, then he only has to pay the fine at the end of the marriage, like a regular ketubah payment. Nevertheless, the other two things, for humiliation and degradation, that he does have to pay her immediately, because those were direct injuries that happen now, and so like anyone you injure, you have to pay that immediately. Mishnah went on and said that both the father, both the rapist and the seducer, the Braita, sorry, continue, this is a Braita, says, that the both her and the father can decide that they don't want the marriage. Okay. They are able to prevent the marriage. Now, let's analyze this. Bishlama mefuta ketib im ma'en yema'en aviha en li ela aviha hi atzma minayin tamod lomar yema'en mikom makom. So we understand that in the case of seduction, both can. So it says if the father refuses, right, then that's fine. So the father can refuse. That's explicit. So I only know the father. How do I know that the girl herself can say, I don't want to marry the seducer? I'm not in. How do you know that she can refuse? Well, because it says a double language, ma'en yima'en. Why the double yima'en? So that means anyone, even her also, if she refuses the marriage, we do not force her into that marriage. Ela ones bishlama'ihi ketiv velo tihe mida'ata ela biha min elan. But regarding the rapist, the pasuk doesn't say the same thing. It doesn't say ima'en yaman aviha regarding the rapist. It just says velo tihiyeh, then she will be to him as a wife. So from the word tihiyeh, we learn that she has to be willing and consent to marrying her. But how do you know that the father also can veto and say, sorry, I don't like you, right? You raped my daughter. I don't want you to be her husband. How do you know that the father has a right to refuse the marriage? We have two answers to this question to prove that the father does have a right to stop the marriage. The rapist should not have a benefit from sinning. In other words, let's say I have a case where before the rape, the father says, I don't like this guy, I don't want you to marry her. So the father has a right for his underage daughter, she's a na'ara, the father has a right to refuse his proposal. And now what are you going to have? The case will be, he comes and seduces her, or worse, rapes her, and now the father has no say. So now the rapist actually benefited from the deal. So that doesn't make sense. Rather, there's talking about rapist. Yeah, we know that with seducer we know already, but the rapist, he should not benefit from raping the daughter, and now the father has no say. That's Abaye's answer. Rava amar kal vachomer uma mefateh shelo avar al ela al dat aviha bilvad ben hi ben aviha yecholin la'akeb. Rava says I can learn from a kal vachomer from the seducer. The seducer we heard from the Pesukim that both the father and the daughter can refuse him. So if in that case where he, the man, the violator, did not go against her agreement, she agreed. It was seduction, but only against the father's will. The father would not have agreed to this, but she didn't ask him. So in that case, where he did not, he got partial agreement from the daughter, even though not from the father, and yet in that case, both the father and the daughter can refuse. all the more so, ones, shavad al dat abiha ve'al dat asma, the rapist who went against both the father's consent and her consent, so he's a worse guy, lo kol sheken, all the more so, that there should be more pushback against him, and that the father also can refuse the marriage. Okay, so that's Rava says a kal vachomer. Now, why don't they agree with each other? Rava lo amar k'Abaye. Rava does not say Abaye's explanation that a person should not benefit from sinning. Kevan de mishalim kenas lav hoten iskaru. After all, he does have to pay a fine, so he's not really benefiting since he does have to pay a fine and he loses out. So even though, in one aspect he doesn't need the father's permission anymore, but it's only called that the sinner profits if it's a net all good, and here he does have to pay, so he's is punished. Abaye lo amar kerava de mefate dihu maseh me'akev abiha name maseh me'akev ones dihu la maseh me'akev abiha name la maseh me'akev. Abaye doesn't agree with Rava's kal vachomer because in the case of the seducer, where he can refuse. In other words, the seducer can say, I don't want to marry her, we're going to see. So the seducer is not forced into the marriage, and therefore, right? He can prevent the marriage. So in that case, the father also can prevent the marriage. So there's a balance, right? He can refuse to marry her, so the father also has the right to refuse him. That's balanced. Ones, where there is less rights in the case of the rapist, he cannot prevent the marriage, right? He has to marry her even against his will. He has to if she wants. So in that case, because he has less options, so too the father has less options, and he cannot prevent the marriage. It's only the girl who can. And therefore the cases are different, and you cannot make that kal vachomer. That's why Abaye has his reason and doesn't agree with Rava's reason. Okay, but either way, everyone agrees that both the father and the daughter can refuse the marriage for both a seducer and a rapist. The question is, where are they deriving it from? Okay, Tanya idach. We have another braita here that says, Afal pi shamru ones noten miyad kesheyosihu en la alav kelum. Braita says, even though the rapist has to pay immediately, that's true, he has to pay right now, and let's say they do get married, when at the end of the marriage, if he divorces her, then he doesn't have to pay anything at the end. We ask a question, we're interrupting the Braita. What do you mean when he divorces her? The law of the rapist says he has to marry her and is not allowed to divorce her his entire life. What we mean is that if she leaves, she is allowed to divorce him. So she can request a divorce, and then he gives her divorce. So should they get divorced for whatever reason, or if she's unfaithful, then he does not have to pay the ketubah payment at the end, because he already paid it at the beginning in the form of the fine. Met yasa kesef kenasa bichtubata. We continue the braita and say, now if he dies, then he does not have to pay the usual ketubah because he already paid the fine. So in other words, the fine is simply an early payment of ketubah. That's according to Tanakama. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda Omer, yesh la ketubah maneh. Rabbi Yosef Rabbi Yehuda says, even though he paid the 50 kesef, which is equal to 200 zuz, at the beginning of the marriage, right after the rape, nevertheless, he has to pay a ketubah. Upon divorce or death, he has to pay 100 maneh like an almanah. Okay, this is very interesting. What are they arguing about? The whole reason for a ketubah that the rabbis established is so that it will not be easy for a man to divorce his wife. Because otherwise, without that, every time she burns the soup, he gets upset. Okay, divorce, get out of here. And there's no consequences upon him. And then women will be treated too lightly. And so therefore, if you say, you have to pay, then when he gets angry, he says, get out of the house, but then he realizes he has to pay, he'll make up, and she'll be treated better. Now, in this case, he is not allowed to divorce her, the rapist, so therefore, this reason does not apply, and that's why there's no need for any ketubah payment at the end. That's Tanakama. In this case, also, she needs some protection because he can always make her life miserable enough until she says, I don't want to stay in the marriage anymore. In other words, even though he can't divorce her, he can indirectly cause her to be so miserable that she will want a divorce, and therefore she still needs protection. If he has to pay 100 maneh, then he'll say, you know what, I'm not going to torture her because I don't want to pay 100 maneh. We'll live together peacefully, and that'll be better. This happens sometimes in modern civil courts, where sometimes there's a difference between whether the husband or the wife files for divorce, and it could be, for example, that it's better for the husband if the wife files for divorce. So then what he does is he tortures her life until she files for divorce, and then, or the other way around in different cases. Okay, ones shote ba'asiso. Now, the last difference is that the rapist has to marry her even if he doesn't want to. Right? You broke it, you bought it. Whereas the seducer, he does not have to. Amar lerava mi parzakya leravashe mikedi migmar gamre mehadadeh. So question is, we already derived things from each other, right? We compared the two cases in terms of the sum of money. How much is it? We know it's 50. 50 what? 50 shekalim. The other place is shekalim doesn't say how much. So we know it's 50 shekalim based on comparing the two. Since you compared them anyway, why don't you compare it for this case, for this also, and say that just like the rapist has to marry her against his will, so too the seducer also, he has to marry her, even if he doesn't want to. So the answer is, Amar Kera mahor yimharinna lo leisha lo midato. Regarding this case of seducer, it says he has to pay a dowry for her to be a wife to him. So law, since it says the word law, it means with his will, only if he wants to. So seduction is different. Good. Kesad shote ba'asi so. The Mishnah brought examples that even if she has a physical flaw, nevertheless, the rapist has to marry her. Amad Rav Kahana, Amrita lishma'ata kamed Rav Zevid, min harde'a, nete aseh v'nitche lo ta'aseh. Question that Rav Kahana said is to Rav Zevid from the Harda'a is, why don't we apply the principle of an aseh overrides a lo ta'aseh? In this case, you have an aseh that he has to marry her, and the lo ta'aseh in the case if she's forbidden, right? If she just has a physical flaw, he has to marry her. But if she's a mamzeret, for example, then he does not marry. Why not? It's true, there's a lav to marry a mamzeret, but there's also misvat aseh for the rapist to marry his victim. So why don't we say he marries her even though she is prohibited to him? אמר לי, היכא אמרינא נתעשה ונתחיל לא תעשה כגון, מילה בשרת, לא אפשר לקיומה לעשה. אבל אחא, היא אמרה דלה בעינה, מי ייתה לעשה כלל. No, it's different. We only apply the principle of aseh overrides a law ta'aseh if it's inevitable. There's no other way around it. For example, you have brit milah and sarat. If someone requires a brit milah, a boy, 8 days old, or a convert, whatever, and that person also has a sarat disease on the orala. Now, there's a law, you're not allowed to cut off a sarat. So that's a law ta'aseh, but there's also mitzvah ta'aseh to give brit milah. Let's say 8 days, right? You have to be done then. So in that case, there's no possibility of doing the aseh without violating the law ta'aseh. That's when we apply that the aseh overrides the law ta'aseh, and you perform the brit milah even though you're cutting off the sarat and violating the lav. But here, not in every case does the aseh applies. For example, if she says, I don't want him, and she refuses him, then there's no marriage. So since the aseh does not apply in every case, over here we do not. So the aseh is less powerful. Therefore, the aseh does not override the law ta'aseh. So just like if she refuses, he doesn't marry her. So too, if she is a mamzeret, he is not allowed to marry her, and he does not fulfill this mitzvah ta'aseh of marriage. Baruch Adonai L'olam, amen v'amen.